Hello and welcome to this video on why it is that TLDR Busniess is wrong, the mistakes they made and errors that destroyed the conclusion to their video. First, some background as necessary. TLDR Busniess is a subsidiary channel of TLDR's network of news and current affairs channels. TLDR covers everything from politics to business and news. It originally focused on Brexit but has since branched out. This means they have at least some claim to be a news organisation, and as such, should be held to news organisation standards. This includes accuracy of reporting. That last point is where we come in. Do note we are not going to go into the semantics of something like race swapping and so on, but we will focus on the methods issue of this video.
Disney is struggling right now. Their share price continues to fall, about 20% in the last year, and Disney Plus is continuing to bleed out hundreds of millions of dollars each and every quarter. But why? Well, according to you, the reason for all of this suffering is that Disney got woke. No.
We will call TLDR Busniess TLDR from now on, and their video is premised on the shift in Disney's stock price, finances, and importantly, a movie success, or lack thereof, recently. This video was published by TLDR on the 19th of August 2023. As a result, they half-assed an analysis of the movie market and used bad methods. In fact, it is arguable that they fell into not only avoidable pitfalls, but they honestly might well have had to go out of their way to fall into these traps. With that, let's start on their video. But first, we have the methods.
We put together a list of factors which could be accused of making a movie woke. With this in hand, we put out a survey where we asked thousands of TLDR viewers if
TLDR relied on both a survey of their audience and an overview of recent movies. On its face value, that is a perfectly legitimate and fair enough method. The problem is execution. As always, the greatest ideas fail when implemented badly. First, this is not maths per se, and this is something that we really do get aggravated by. TLDR talks about doing the math on this. Math is an element of what they are doing, but you can't just rely on the maths. And this might be the basis for all the following problems: underestimating what they were trying to do, and then not living up to what they were trying to do as a result. The first issue we have is the catalogue of movies. They explicitly rely on a select sample of movies, approximately 60. This includes The Little Mermaid, Indiana Jones, Haunted Mansion, and Strange World, amongst others. The problem here, and we will be jumping ahead slightly from what their video's order is that they ignore the rest of Disney's franchises, the most notable being Star Wars and Marvel. The reason this is important is a simple example. They selectively added Indiana Jones, a Lucasfilm movie, to the broad catalogue of Disney properties, while not adding other Lucasfilm franchises like Star Wars. In fact, they later explicitly carve out Marvel and Star Wars as separate entities. This is a big problem. When you have a data set, you don't start redefining the categories so you can move each of the contents around until you are satisfied or happy with the numbers you have. To use a somewhat more practical and real-world example, let's start with a negative. That is, where you miss data for being too narrow. Using skin cancer, we can examine this. If we are trying to identify if sun exposure causes cancer, and specifically skin cancer, we need data. In this first case, we could just say all skin cancer. The problem is, not all skin cancer is from sun exposure. That would overcount the prevalence and attribute things like chemical exposure to sunlight instead. Conversely, if we only include melanomas, then we may miss any other kind of skin cancer. This undercounts the prevalence. You need to specifically target what you are looking at and use a consistent standard or definition, and importantly, you need to have the appropriate categories. In this case, Disney movies are going to include originals, Star Wars, and Marvel properties. The way TLDR has done this, they are artificially deflating the number of Disney movies, thereby skewing the results. And this is more important when they clearly distinguish movies like Lightyear and Element as from other studios. The problem is that Pixar, who made these movies, is owned by Disney too. There are 22 movies made by Disney specifically called out. Of these, 11 are original Disney properties, and specifically attributed to them. 5 are under the Star Wars brand, 8 under the Marvel branding, and then there are 9 under the Pixar branding. The remainder of the 60 movies are then ignored at one point, which is another issue again. It means that TLDR has ignored more than half the movies and sliced Disney's franchises up into smaller amounts and then tried to analyze them in a weird and wonderful way, which is the first and perhaps most significant problem with what they're trying to do here, and means their conclusions are useless.
And liberal messages. The thing is, what is woke? Well, it's traditionally been defined as someone who's alert and concerned about social injustice and discrimination. But to determine how this actually applies to cinema, we scoured Reddit and Quora conversations to find the most frequently cited reasons for wokeness. And
now we have definitions, and specifically we're talking about the definition of woke. TLDR gives the definition of woke as alert to and concerned about social injustice and discrimination. It seems, however, this was not good enough, so they went looking for an alternative. This is a big red flag. Arguably not just a big red flag, but a giant blimp that is coloured red, firing off fireworks and screaming. That is how much of a problem what they have done is. You don't get a definition, realize you don't like it, and then try to rework and redefine said definition. This is more true when you try to manually generate a list of things you're going to use to define it. This raises issues around the criteria, the people, sources, quality control, proofing, and more. All of these things are normally spelled out very clearly in any methodology looking at what they're doing. On that alone, they failed, and failed badly. For the sake of the strongest lessons to be taken away from this, and arguably the strongest rebuttal to the video, let's assume that even though they've not presented any evidence to the contrary, they did everything right. This leads to how they used that information, and it was a survey.
If they thought these features really made a movie more woke. And having crunched this data, there are 7...
The surveys are notoriously bad for a range of issues, not the least of which is the sample size, the people who responded, the kind of responses you get, and so on. Which does raise issues we'll need to mention later on about the statistical power that they were looking for. The problem is, the survey is the crux of their thesis. The problem the crux holds is that the entire video is bad as a result of their thesis being malformed. Beyond the self-selecting issue of people not wanting to share their email, which is the very first thing this survey asks for, and then not knowing how many people went on to answer the survey, or better yet, saw this and then noped out, we have other significant issues. Let's start with the far left, and no pun intended. There is the political identification. Self-identify politically is fraught with peril. Using a scale of 1 to 10 for far right or far left leaning is odd to start with. Most ordinal scales like this are 1 to 10, but beyond that, it is an ordinal scale, or in other words, numerical. You can't really put these in containers and say, here's the meaning of someone who says they are a 7. That might mean they are a 7.5 or a 6.5. There is a lot of leeway when you do it this way. A slider might arguably be better, but honestly tick boxes, or as with the rest of the survey, a circle that you select with a given option. There is no range involved in that respect. Doing so would remove a lot of ambiguity and make it far easier to be able to honestly attribute some of their latter conclusions accurately. Next we have how many movies in a month, which again is a self-selecting question and likely not relevant. Unless, before running tests, TLDR chose a minimum number of monthly movies as a cutoff for responses to count, this means nothing. It's simply a random extra variable that they can try and have a p-hacking attempt at to find significance down the track, and indicates that this was not done correctly. Then the next question is an issue. It immediately skews the results by suggesting the answer that TLDR wants to see. That is, TLDR asks, are movies getting too woke? This is not the right way to phrase a question for a survey. A question like this should be far less biased. For example, are movies woke, or how liberal are movies, and then give a scale might have been a better way of phrasing this. But once you start including words like woke in it, you have a problem. But when you pose a question like this, it is similar to how a lawyer in court asks, or can be accused of asking someone, a leading question. It suggests an answer already, and it is why a lot of surveys will either give a specified list and then ask for others, or a very narrow scope of options. They don't want to suggest what the answer should be. The next issue we have to raise is that they ask about every movie that was available. Well, not every movie, but the degree that it is likely that people have not seen the full catalogue of this survey. There needed to be a not applicable or did not watch option. Without this, people would complete the survey and use the next best option, in this case artificially inflating either the neutral or unsure responses. Now TLDR does say that they didn't require people to complete every single movie. However, this is not obvious in the way the survey question is presented, and it means that the responses, particularly in this section, may have been completed incorrectly. There is a very big need for clarity around what TLDR meant by "we've chosen a bunch of recent movies." What was this bunch defined by? Release date? Publisher? What? This again is like the criteria used earlier. It is just too laissez-faire. The last obvious problem with the survey as used is the things they use to examine what makes a movie woke. If this was being done properly, this part of the survey should have been done first, and that is before trying to redefine woke or doing any of this other work. They should have run a survey to find what it is that is considered woke. Doing this would have completely sidestepped the issues of redefining woke as they did, because they had found what they needed to apply and had an actual working definition, or at least a series of criteria that they could have applied. This would have avoided the entire issue they had of using the existing definition and finding that too hard. When TLDR goes on to discuss the results, all we know is that they had supposedly received responses of several thousand viewers. This is a problem, and one of many that we've mentioned so far, but this one is particularly noteworthy.
There are 7 things which make a movie more woke, and they are the discussion of trans issues, male privilege and white privilege, race swapping and gender swapping, and the discussion of issues related to sexual orientation and toxic masculinity. Although if you filter for just those who self-identify as right-wing, that order does change a little.
First, we don't know how many respondents. If they had 1, 100 or 100,000 responses, it is going to be a very different story. Also, that same issue should apply to every conclusion of a sort. That is, to use an example, X percentage said they found racial issues made a movie more woke, and so on. This is important because it means if it is a minority, for example, only 10% of people found this, they have then cherry-picked this result because they didn't tell us what percentage it was, and this will be an issue later on. And more importantly, it doesn't tell us if it is actually consistent across all of their respondents, or at least a vast majority. When this is done, it was done just by the raw aggregate number, which doesn't mean a lot, and we'll have more on this shortly. Importantly, they should be doing statistical testing, mostly on these sorts of numbers and whether or not there's a difference in the, say, left-wing, right-wing grouping compared to the average or left versus right, but we'll get more on that later. The survey itself needed to be giving a lot more details on how it was disseminated. That is, was it in YouTube community announcements, on Twitter or X, via email subscriber lists, or what? Depending on how they got responses, they may have artificially skewed the response. This is done by self-selecting the respondents. For example, if they've only sent it out to people on their email list, they may have only received responses from those individuals, and that means you've cut out a huge aspect of society. If it was those on Twitter or X, the same thing. This is one reason why you really need a multifaceted recruitment process. If they've only relied on, say, their own email list for subscribers, it is a good indicator that the whole survey idea was wasted, because none of the results they have could really be relied on. Alrighty, let's start with how the results were used. They only gave measures against the percentage of respondents who are right-wing, that is conservative. Since we don't know the total response rate for conservatives, this doesn't mean a lot. Much like earlier, if they had 100 or 100,000 conservative responses as a count, then the significance will vary drastically. More so once you then compare that rate against the total response rate. For the most part, this can be simplified to left versus right, but we can't do that. We don't know how many total responses there were, and since we only know the percentage of conservative or right-wing responses, we can't figure out how many left or liberal responses there were. This means we're not really getting a comparison of apples to apples. We're simply looking at apples versus fruit salad. We can't do this, and it's simple, as they did not provide or use a clear and simple conservative or right-wing versus liberal or left-wing metric. They had a scale, and this is the other issue. A scale where you would either need to dismiss the percentage of neutral or center respondents who replied to the 4, or only count those who replied to the 1 or 7. You basically need to split these numbers up, and this is another issue again, and why you shouldn't be using a scale for this kind of thing. You should be putting it into categories. When TLDR did this, it pretty much lets them choose whatever they want to get a significant result. It is a bad design, arguably a very bad design. Further, filtering by percentages is not a valid statistical test. Not in this instance anyway. There are cases where you may be using that, but not this time.
Now, there is a slight downward trend here, but with an R-squared value of 0.03, it's an incredibly weak correlation that falls way below the standard needed to be statistically significant.
This, of course, leads us on to statistical testing and, importantly, statistical significance. TLDR used a scatter plot. This is a legitimate way of showing results. It is simple and, for the most part, intuitive. What is odd is that TLDR uses a much narrower range than they had previously described as being for their index. TLDR goes on to use Rotten Tomatoes data. Not a good indicator, but sure. They would have been better either using box office ticket revenue, count, or similar. There are a range of other metrics, but TLDR did what TLDR did, and as can be seen, this is not great. This leads to them trying to use correlation. Correlation does not equal causation. The very fact they are trying to argue causation based on correlation is just wrong in so many ways. And now we have the correlation issue on top of everything else. TLDR uses the R-square value. This can be useful if all you want to do is quickly get an idea of the strength of a relationship. Of course, the variables need to be related, and importantly, you need to be comparing things that work using the R-square value. In this case, TLD's video is just no. TLDR should have started by using something like chi-square, a Spearman's correlation, or an ANOVA test. It depends on exactly how they set up their assessments, as you can't really call this a test at this stage, but it would allow them to appropriately choose the right statistical test. For example, if they had been categorizing individuals responding, then you can't just use a t-test. You need to use an appropriate statistical test, and there are decision support trees out there to tell you what test to use based on what you're choosing to do with it. TLDR also makes the major mistake of trying to relate the R-square value with statistical significance.
Now, there is a slight downward trend here, but with an R-squared value of 0.03, it's an incredibly weak correlation that falls way below the standard needed to be statistically significant.
Statistical significance is commonly put at an alpha or p-value of significance of 0.05. Ironically, 0.03 is lower, therefore this would be statistically significant if they had done a statistical test, but they haven't. In this case, it is an R-square value. That tells you nothing of the statistical significance. TLDR manages to just really mess this one up. They continue to mess this up even when trying to make their case look stronger by adjusting for only audience scores from Rotten Tomatoes. still insisting somehow that an R-square value tells you about statistical significance. No, it doesn't. There is also the issue that TLDR uses the aggregate slope or regression model. Since the question is the more work a movie is, the worse Disney will be, TLDR should have been breaking this down by studio. That is Disney, DreamWorks, and so on. That would tell you if the relationship between wokeness and failure was there for Disney. This has TLDR just adding extra random noise in the background to confuse the picture, and no matter what you did, it would throw the results off because you've just put extra crap in there and said, but it makes a picture now. No. It would be like somebody trying to say that they could see pictures in static. No. For a video that says the data is not truly statistically significant, the video has failed to do that very same thing. There are no p-values or something similar showing that there was or was not statistical significance. This is all the more annoying as even though it is not the best option, you can still do all of this in Excel or open source equivalents. There is no reason why TLDR half-assed it by not actually doing statistical tests. TLDR just makes this worse when they tried the whole let's account for profit loss for exactly the same reasons. A side note worth making is that 0 is not the lowest possible score either. R-square values go from -1 to +1. That means the lowest negative is, well, -1, and that means a very strong negative or nigh on perfectly negative relationship between the two variables. All the 0 tells us is that there's no obvious relationship. And knowing how badly TLDR cocked this up, we can look at how you could go about fixing this video's approach. The first is the aforementioned accurate and specific testing that would remove the issue of noise. The next is to test for normality, which will tell the appropriate path to start going down in any stat decision tree. Remembering, however, that their sample size is relatively tiny. If you didn't have the means of doing that, you could instead try trimming outliers. That is, to set so many standard deviations and anything outside that gets removed as a data point. It isn't a good method, but it helps to cluster your results more, and that lets you better analyze for things like data. Data like TLDR has been using. Further, it is important to either compare all results as one. This is done in part, like TLDR's video, but not with theirs because they're not comparing like to like, so you get a mess. Rather, you compare something like, say, left and right wing views, which TLDR only half did. We tried our hand at this by eyeballing the results that TLDR presented, so it's not accurate to the exact same data that TLDR has unused, but we found it could be done in about 10 minutes by eyeballing the numbers. And it would have been much quicker, more accurate, and easier if we had access to the raw data, which means there's no reason why, and certainly no doubt, that they could have done this themselves. When we did this, comparing studio movies against movies from the same studio to get an apples-to-apples comparison, we found anywhere between an R-square value of 10 and 40. This is before we even look at using different trend lines. There may well be a different relationship between how work a movie is and how it goes for profit and loss, or anything else for that matter. For example, a little bit of work content may have a almost negligible effect on the movie, or it may have a huge effect with diminishing effects after that initial impact. In this case, when we ran statistical testing, ironically enough, we found statistically significant results when comparing workness and the profit-loss margins. Our p-value was 0.00002, and our alpha was 0.05, but even at the more strenuous and arduous 0.01 alpha value, we still find significance. That means that TLDR is just wrong. Their very conclusions could not be any more wrong, as they are completely opposite to what reality is.
Now, using these numbers and using this equation more specifically, we created the TLDR Wokeness Index. It's not really a trademark, it just looks more fun that way. This index,
And now for the Wokeness Index. This is a case of what the hell are you trying to do? Just because you make a formula doesn't mean it has any value, and this is particularly important in surveys. In this case, most surveys rely on an established and proofed survey methodology along with a proofed survey. This is so they can use the established and proved formulas to reach significant conclusions. You don't just randomly and spuriously make up your own. As for the results of that index, it is meant to be between positive 200 and negative 200. Why this scale is given when no movie seems to have scored more than positive 94 or less than negative 95 is odd.
This index, which produces scores between positive and negative 200, gives us an indication of how woke each movie is determined to be by the thousands of people who took this survey. The question being, which are the wokest movies on the list? Well, the top 10 according to you are Turning Red, Mulan, Strange World, Lightyear, Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny, Black Panther 2, The Rise of Skywalker, The Last Jedi, Barbie, and The Little Mermaid. On the other end of the spectrum, though, movies like Spider-Man No Way Home, the Super Mario movie, Cocaine Bear, Puss in Boots, The Last Wish, and Oppenheimer make up the bottom of our list.
The scale is completely wrong for the results obtained. That screams that there was something fishy going on. There's also a range of effectively 200, and that being negative 100 and positive 100. The most non-woke based or something similar films were between negative 95 and negative 65. The most woke films were between positive 25 and positive 94. You can probably already see there is a problem. When one is a range of 30 and the other is a range of nearly 70, the metrics, data, and methods are just not good. It means you really aren't getting a good sample size given such a huge spread, and your, let's call it formula, is honestly not appropriate. The same scale is then used to arrange all the results without political alignment or any kind of real adjustment, which is another issue again, although they do attempt to address it. This is very important when we begin to look at the wokeness index crap per studio. Notice that they mark a wokeness index for Disney of 9.6. We've already been told that the movies had a wide range and up to 70 based on the numbers they gave us. That tells you right away that the standards of deviation is going to be huge, and you have problems. This only gets worse for Star Wars, which is already, as noted, a Disney franchise, so cutting these out is going to not only skew the results, but arguably make them just wrong. We then compare the results of Disney with Universal, who had a wokeness rating of negative 42.4, and the range of their movies had a, range of 30. That means your standard deviation is going to be much smaller by comparison to Disney and Star Wars.
So, does this prove that the idea of go woke, go broke is untrue? Well, I definitely wouldn't make that argument. Our survey and data are relatively rudimental, and our analysis is limited by the constraints of this video. However, from the data we have, it does seem that any strong correlation between movie studios going woke and losing money seems pretty unfounded. So, if...
Rudimentary is a very kind self-description of TLDR's video. A more accurate description is to say they tried their hand at something that any half-trained monkey could learn how to do on YouTube in an hour or less and get better results. For a channel that is meant to be both business and news focused, they have failed in both regards and should be held to higher standards, and not given a free pass for this bullshit. By no means should it be beyond the abilities of an average person to do this, and more so a rather successful YouTube channel. Even we aren't any kind of expert or specialist in stats, yet we could do this with the back of envelope or napkin type calculations. That is to say, very few resources and even less time, yet TLDR could not. This just represents bad reporting, bad ethics, and some degree of either incompetence or malice in the way they've conducted themselves. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.